I see lips
Sorry.
moving.
Yep, there you go. Okay, so I was saying when I was muted was it's always great to see Dr. Christine here. She's our CEO and founder of Athena Valley of the Sun. So she's our driving force, and we always love seeing her here. Thank you all for joining us today. We're so excited. It's January 2021, and that's always a good thing. So Katie Van Horn has joined us for diversity webinar this morning. Will be done at 12 noon, I promise. But if you want to stick around a little later, we can do some one-on-one networking. And also stick around to the end because we have a prize drawing as we do every month, and you have to be here to win. So we have some great prizes. So I'm going to introduce you to Katie. She has her diversity, equity, and inclusive learning and unlearning slide up there. So Katie is an HR strategist and an international keynote speaker on global inclusion, diversity, and belonging, IDB. She's a former VP of engagement and inclusion for GoDaddy, a Fortune 500 company, where she helped build a truly special IDB culture. She now leads VH Included consulting and coaching, focusing on partnering with global organizations to strengthen their cultures. She sits on the Multicultural Advisory Board for One Community AZ and is an industry advisor for Hitchworks. She's particularly interested in moving underrepresented groups into leadership to achieve IDB goals. And that's where we really come together as Athena and Katie Van Horn. And she was one of our Hail recipients for 2020. So we were really excited to have her as a Hail recipient. Katie is also the co-host of an Inclusive AF podcast where she discusses diversity, equity, and inclusion topics. So I am going to turn it over to Katie. Katie, thank you so much.
Okay, I don't know what's going on. Are you, sorry. Hi, just want to make sure I'm in control of the slides. All good. So good morning. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to talk through, as Mary Lynn mentioned, just diversity, equity, and inclusion, and some of the learning and unlearning that we need to do as leaders and we need to do just as humans. So we'll dig right in. So here's some things that we know. And I'd like to share this and kind of start the conversation off with this because I think there's, you know, we have so much different things, so many different data points coming at us all the time. And so just grounding us in some of the data and some of the things that we know to be true, things that we know are real, I think is a good place to start. So the first piece is just that studies, Boston Consulting Group did a study around companies and their gender diversity. And when we had greater gender diversity, so that means 8 out of every 20 managers were female, that generated 34% more revenues or higher revenues from innovative products and services in their most recent 3-year period. That's huge. And that's, you know, bottom line results that you can definitely see. That compares with innovation results or revenues of 25% for companies that have the least gender diversity, or only 1 in 20 managers were female. I want to talk about gender, but we're going to talk about also women of color and people of color overall, because I think there's some pieces here that are good for us to know. So right now in the Fortune 500, the percentage of female CEOs in the Fortune 500 is 6.5%. 6.5%. The number of Black CEOs in the Fortune 500 is 3, not 3%, 3 people. The percentage of Latinx CEOs in the Fortune 500 is 3.5%. And so these are numbers that unfortunately have kind of stayed steady. And it's something that we need to be aware of and be thinking about as we think about, you know, how do we move the needle? How do we think about the future of organizations and how we can make organizations better? As many as 1 in 4 women are considering downsizing or shifting or leaving theirs completely because of the pandemic. So some of the work that's already been done and what the gains have been made for women in their careers, we're going to see a shift, or we're already seeing a shift, that those numbers are already starting to move down because of the COVID-19 pandemic and the impacts to women. The one in the bottom right corner I want to talk about for just 1 second, and this is from the McKinsey Women in the Workplace. So for every 100 men promoted to manager, only 85 were promoted. And this gap is even larger for women of color. So only 58 Black women and 71 Latinas were promoted. And again, this is data that, we know to be true. And the companies that participate in the McKinsey study, they do this every year. And it's great data to have and to ground us. And then the last one is that, Dr. Ibram X. Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, it held the #1 spot on the New York Times nonfiction list for 4 weeks after the murder of George Floyd. These are all things we know. We also know there's a broken rung. And, a lot of us have heard of the glass ceiling for women in the workplace, that you can only, achieve a certain level in an organization. But there's also this concept called the broken rung. And that's basically when women are trying to move from an individual contributor role into a leader. Them being able to do that is just not happening. It's harder for women to do that, which continues to hold women back in their career and in advancing in their career. Next one is that we all have bias. I think, there's a lot of conversations about unconscious bias, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the biases that come up, but we need to be aware that every single one of us has bias, and going to an unconscious bias training for an hour is not going to solve it. I'm sorry to say, I would like that to be the case, but bias is something that's inherent and, is great ingrained in us from birth, basically. So we need to be aware of that bias. In 2019, women of color represented 18% of entry-level positions, few advanced to leadership positions. And so managers were at 12%, senior managers at 9%, VPs at 7%, SVPs at 5%, and C-suite positions at 4%. That's another data point from the McKinsey study. The world's women, the UN does a study each year for the world's women, and this is another data point that I think is just really critical to know. Women held only 28% of managerial positions in 2019, which is almost the same as 1995. So again, we're not seeing a lot of growth in some of these areas that are truly important. So we can see growth overall and see changes in these organizations. And over to the right, we have only 3% of Fortune 500 companies are transparent about the demographics of their workforce. We're seeing the transparency at the leadership level, but when you look at the rest of the organization, we're not getting that transparency. And we're seeing a lot of organizations who aren't reporting this data, which we hope will soon, because it's a critical thing to know, kind of where are we and what still needs to be worked on, and where are these large organizations seeing results or not. The last piece, and this is something I think is so critical to Athena, such a conversation that we have all the time, as part of the Athena network, is that networking is one of those most critical ways that women can find positions on boards and in leadership roles. And that's just something to keep in mind, that, the network that you have, how are you growing that network? How are you diversifying that network? That is all critical to how we actually succeed and move forward and move into some of those leadership roles. So now we're going to shift to what we've learned. And I'll preface this before we go to the next slide by just saying, this is what we have learned since birth, and, how we are socialized on our beliefs and on our bias, and those things that really impact us in our day-to-day. So this is the cycle of socialization. It's actually something that has been adapted from Bobby Harrow. And it just gives you a little bit of a visual of how we are actually socialized on beliefs, and how we come to a place of believing certain things or not believing certain things. So we start at the beginning, or, this could be birth, this could be, the start of something new. In that beginning, the first socialization you have is usually with your parents or with your family members. And so what you're hearing from your family members, what you're hearing to be true or to be, their beliefs, you're hearing that kind of day in and day out when you're thinking about whatever your beliefs might be. Then you into school and into kind of more of that cultural socialization, where you are a part of institutions, you're starting to go into the workforce, possibly, things along those lines. And so what you believe and what you have heard is being reinforced, and it's being, you know, hey, yes, now I'm seeing this actually happen. And this is also where you start to see some of that confirmation bias, where, you know, you believe something to be true, so everything you see confirms what you believe. And so that's where that reinforcement comes into play, and when the enforcement comes into play. So we need to be aware of that. And that kind of brings us to the result, what we believe to be true and what we, you know, take as, yes, this is absolute. And it can go two different ways. You could say, yes, this is absolutely something that I believe, and the action you take is you're going to continue that cycle. Or you can have a change and go, you know what, I don't believe that. Let me ask some questions. Let me, you know, think about what the experience is for that person, or whatever it might be. So you have that raising of your consciousness, which then can lead you to take the action to change and to get better and to learn more and keep questioning. And that is just, you know, a cycle that I like to share this just to, again, set the tone of how did we get here? Because I think a lot of times there is this, you know, internal struggle of, well, I believe this because I know it's true, versus, you know, here's some things that have happened to us throughout our lives to reinforce and to create these beliefs that may or may not be true. So when we think about some of the beliefs that we have, then we have to turn to the bias. And so, you know, bias is that cognitive shortcut in how we process information. And so when we think about bias, the way to kind of put this into context, and it's one that I kind of jokingly use when I do workshops, is, you know, if you met a bear in the woods, what would you do? And, you know, it's the whole idea that, you know, if you met the bear in the woods, there's a couple different actions you might take. You might run the other way. You might play dead. You might, you know, raise your hands and try and be big. There's a lot of different things that you can do to react to a bear in the woods. And how do you know to do that? It's not because you possibly, maybe you have, but a lot of times you haven't met a bear in the woods before, but you know that because it's been socialized through media, through your parents, through, you know, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, whatever it might be, that you learn these things that if you meet a bear in the woods, you need to react. Now, that's something that obviously will keep you safe. But bias is those shortcuts that happen in how we process information, and it's usually wrong. And so it's that bias that we have creates an outcome or creates an action that we take that is incorrect. So when we think about those cognitive shortcuts and the millions of, you know, data points that are coming into our brain at any given time, we need to be aware of how are we processing that? How are we thinking about that? And like I said, you know, you can go through the unconscious bias training and that kind of thing, and it's not going to completely solve the problem, and it's not going to cure you. But when you think about the bias that you have and are aware of those things, that's one way to counterbalance it. So this chart is one that I'm not going to go into every single one, I promise. But I like to share a little bit of these because I think it's important for us to know what are the impacts of bias and what are the things that actually can come into play and what are the different types of bias that we might have. So there are over 150 different types of bias. Now, not all of them are listed here or are shown here, but we need to be aware of some of these and again, how they impact us. So when you think about the cognitive bias that you have and how that impacts the workplace. So the color coding here, just to help a little bit, when we think about the green or you know, greenish color, those are those social biases that we have. So this might be, you know, hey, the whole team thinks this certain way, so it must be that bandwagon effect. Or it might be the stereotyping, believing that, you know, a person is a certain way because of who they are, what group they belong to, whatever that might be. Or it might be that, you know, hey, the competitor's doing well because they're cheap or because they're taking shortcuts or things like that, which is that reactive devaluation. So being aware of those is really important. The second one is that financial bias. And this can come into play and absolutely can have impacts to your business because it might be a situation where you think, hey, you know, the post-purchase rationalization, we bought this and wow, that was a good call. We made a good call in doing that when we did. Or it might be the, hey, let's just get this done. Let's get the deal done. Let's make sure we just close this, versus actually stepping back and saying, are we doing all the right things here? And those are some of the financial risks. The failure to estimate, or the yellow options. I already mentioned confirmation bias, where, it's the, hey, we tried this 2 or 3 times, so here's what the answer is, without really testing it enough times or checking in to make sure it's true. And then also the belief bias. So, hey, it's the, I didn't quite follow what you're saying, but I'm just going to go with what you said because it sounds okay, or it sounds right. And that is another one that can impact that bottom line result. And then the last one is the short-termism. And these are the whole idea around, hey, we tested this, or hey, we've always done it this way, so we've got to keep doing this way. Or we tested it once and it seemed all right, so we should be good to go. Or the illusion of validity, where it's the overestimating our ability. So, hey, this worked fine in another location, it should be fine here, without actually checking and making sure. And what these things do, all of these different types of bias, they impact the business relationship that you have with other people, and can impact the bottom line results that we see. And so I wanted to just call out a few of those. And again, this is not all of them. There's quite a few other pieces. And when you look at the different pieces of the employee life cycle, so from the point when you touch base with someone to possibly have them as a candidate into your organization, all through hiring them and onboarding them and creating their career path, all of those things, the different types of bias that you have in play can impact their experience and can impact how long they stay with your organization, how productive they are, all of those things. So how can we unlearn? This is the key, that I think we need to pause, and we need to start thinking about what are the things that we can do differently, and how can we start to unlearn some of this stuff that has been in us since birth, and how do we start to pause and reflect on how can we do better? So the first piece, or the first thing to consider, is that critical thinking. And I love this example, and I can't take credit for it, but I do like to use it, and I do like to talk about it because I think it's really important. And this is one that I think we can all relate to right now, especially with, some of the things that are happening politically, et cetera, that there's this, hey, there's only 2 sides to the coin. So there's only 2 sides to the argument, and it's either this way or that way, but that's it, black or white. And what we need to do when we're thinking critically is consider the diamond, and the many facets of the diamond, and the many different things that come into play, and how that might impact our decision-making, and how that might impact how we interact with folks. Because I think when you start to go, is this right? And kind of ask yourself some questions, step back and think critically about, why do you believe a certain thing? Why do you have this specific stereotype against a group or person? Why do you think it has to be done this certain way? When you start to think critically and look at the different facets of the diamond or the issue, that's when we start to grow and get better. The second piece is just to show empathy. So when we talk about, how do we actually stop and pause and recognize our bias? The first way is just to see things from their point of view, or see their world. What is the experience that they're actually having? How are you interacting with them, and kind of the, put yourself in their shoes. And this goes to the whole, the golden rule that we all know: treat people the way that you want to be treated. But it takes it a step further to say, treat them the way that they want to be treated. So when you're showing empathy and saying, let me understand your experience, let me understand what you have seen, or how you have experienced the world. That's just one way for us to really show empathy and start to understand people in a different way. The second is to appreciate them as human beings. And, this is one that a lot of times when we talk about some of the issues that occur around diversity, equity, and inclusion, there's this othering, or this, putting people in buckets and dehumanizing them, versus really focusing on the fact that they are human beings and they are individuals. So we need to not judge them as, oh, you're this certain group, so that's why you think this way. Talking to them one-on-one and truly appreciating them as a human being is just another way to show empathy and kind of grow your skill set with that. The third, understanding their feelings and understanding feelings overall. This is also like understanding why people take certain actions, why people do certain things. So if you're, why did they act this way or react this way? Why did they feel this way? And this kind of goes to some of the things that we see around, the stereotypes or the reactions that we're seeing around the racial injustices that are going on. There's this belief of, okay, well, I just don't understand why they're reacting this way, or we feel like they're overreacting to some of the social justice issues. But it's not a, one and done. And that is why there is a certain reaction that comes up. It's because the feelings that they have are things that have built over time. And this is not just a new thing that, we're starting to see. So understanding, again, that their point of view, understanding their feelings, understanding how they are actually viewing the world helps. And the last one is just communicating understanding. And this is, you can call it a sales tactic, you can call it a lot of different things, but this is the almost, repeating back what they say to make sure that you understand, and going back to them and saying, I heard what you said. And while you might not, have had the experience, you can at least empathize and say, I understand what you're saying, and I want to hear more. I want to listen more. I want to understand more. And that's just a great way for us to continue to show empathy, and also continue to, again, make sure that we're treating individuals as human beings. Oh. So the next step is really to understand those systemic challenges. So we know in organizations, and we know, within the systems that are in place throughout the United States, historically, there have been a lot of different things that need to be challenged and need to be questioned at this point in time. And we need to start to think, is this the right way to do it? Is this the right way to approach these things? So the first one, and really sticking to the organization, really we need to think about diversity, equity, and inclusion as a business imperative. So a lot of times DEI is seen as, some HR thing that they're working on over there, and we don't need to worry about it. But when you saw those stats up front about how this can truly impact your bottom line results, and you start to see and hear some of the news stories around, leaders leaving organizations, they didn't feel like they had an inclusive environment. When you start to understand the impact of not focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion, you start to understand why it's so important. And this should be part of your business strategy. This shouldn't just be a nice to have. It's important because, it's kind of the product idea. Unless you have a extremely niche product where you only are selling to one type of person and one very small group, you need to take consideration of who could be buying your product, who is your buyer, thinking about, who actually could be impacted by this, and making sure that the team building that product is reflective of those customers, is reflective of who you're trying to actually work with and work for. The systems we know keep certain groups marginalized. And, this one I'll talk about just a bit around kind of an HR project or an HR function, and that's a review process. So a lot of times in organizations, they will have this review process, and really a lot of times the people that get promoted are the squeaky wheels. And we need to think about that and be thoughtful about that, because if we're keeping certain groups because they're quiet, because they keep their head down, because of whatever it might be that could be cultural or gender or whatever it might be, a belief they might have, we need to think about how our systems are actually supporting our people and make sure we're creating an equitable environment. The next one is equity versus equality. So, we talk and use equity and equality interchangeably, but they are not the same. Equality is kind of that level playing field. And I'm sure a lot of you have seen the visual of, the three people watching a baseball game or some sort of sports game. And, one person is on a box and another person is on the ground, and who can see over the fence and who can't see over the fence. When we talk about equality, it's everyone has that level playing field. When we talk about equity, though, we talk about what people need to be successful. What are the things that are in place to make sure that everyone has an equal opportunity to advance their career, to do a great job, to focus on their work? And that can be a lot of different things that can impact your employee. And we'll talk about that in just a second, a little bit more. The next one is leadership commitment. I work with a lot of organizations, and a lot of times it's the HR person that I start working with, and we'll have these conversations. I'm like, okay, so what does the CEO think? And it's, oh, well, we haven't really talked about it with them. Oh, well, we're not sure yet. Having that leadership buy-in, that leadership commitment to this conversation, because it is a business imperative, first off, but also because, we know that, yes, we can start from a grassroots perspective and kind of that bottom-up approach, but we need to have the top-down commitment and understanding as well to actually make that shift and make those changes. So that leader commitment is really important. And then transparency, transparency, transparency. So I already mentioned this a little bit, but making sure that we're being transparent about where are we in the process. And this is also one for leaders to admit when you make a mistake, because we're all on a journey, we're all learning, and there are some things that you're going to say, there are things that you're going to do, there's actions that you're going to take, and you're going to think, wow, this is the greatest thing ever. And then you talk to your employees and they're not in agreement. They don't think it's a good thing. And so being able to pause and say, I made a mistake, apologize, and learn from it, that is critical in this conversation. But being transparent about those mistakes so your other team members know, hey, I can make a mistake and it's not the end of the world. And making sure that they realize that really it's about learning and growing from that experience. But it's also about transparency around the data and sharing with your team, if not externally, what's going on in the organization and how are you actually doing on some of these different points. When we talk about demographic data, that's a lot of the things that people talk about and what's seen visibly externally, but it's also about how are people doing within the organization. Are you doing a pulse survey? Are you checking in on how folks are doing? Are you making sure they're okay? And are you being transparent about what we need to do and what actions we need to take to get even better? Oh my goodness. Understanding the current challenges. So this is also, when we think about, the current state that we're in with COVID-19 specifically, but I think these are ones that could be applied at any point in time. And just knowing that and knowing that these are current challenges for your employees and how they're react to current events. So, I think that the biggest one, and we heard this quite a bit, and I think it's still a concern for folks, is that anxiety over layoffs or furloughs. This is something that, everyone's worried about. Everyone is worrying like, okay, hey, how is the company doing? Are they successful? Are they doing okay? Or do we need to worry about losing our jobs or being furloughed? The second one is burnout. And, I will say myself included, I think we all have experienced this in the last year where it's just too much. There's too many things coming at us. There's too many things that we're, trying to process and trying to deal with. So recognizing that and saying, you know what, I'm feeling, the burnout and I need to step back, but also recognizing that in your employees and knowing when you need to give them a break and say, you know what, take the next couple of days off or whatever that might look like. So giving them some space. The next one is mental health. And this is one that has definitely been on the radar for folks and is being talked about quite a bit. But mental health is one that I think has historically been kind of under the covers, and we don't talk about it a lot and we don't acknowledge it a lot, but we need to be more vocal about what this impact is for our folks and how this impacts them in the day-to-day, especially knowing we have a lot of people working from home. We have a lot of people who are isolated. We have a lot of folks that maybe are in a situation at home that isn't ideal. So recognizing that, we need to be aware of that mental health strain on folks. And again, kind of that goes with the burnout as well, but understanding where folks are in their mental health journey. Childcare and or homeschooling responsibilities. So I know families that are trying to work through, is school going to be open? Is it not going to be open? Is it online? Or what are we doing? How do we set up, the computers just the right way so everyone can be online? And how do we deal with Wi-Fi? All of these things. And I think for so many parents, they're acting as parent, they're acting as teacher, they're acting as entertainer, short order cook, all of these different things. And recognizing that there might be times when they need to step out of a meeting, or there might be a child in the background as you're trying to have a conversation about something, things along those lines, and understanding that challenge. The next one is the physical and mental health of loved ones. So, I think we can, in this one, understand that it's also the toll that they take on so many of us with parents that are older, and so many of us that maybe have been impacted by COVID-19. So this could be a bereavement situation. This could be, wow, I can't get my mom in to get her shot, now that she is, in that group that can now get a shot. All of these different things that are weighing on folks, and being aware of that and how that might impact them in their day-to-day. And the last one is financial insecurity. And this might be one where you're like, oh no, they have had a job the whole time, so everything's fine. But I think we also have to recognize some of the pieces that are coming into play that we might not be aware of. Maybe they have a spouse or significant other that has had some financial insecurity in their role. This might be a situation where they've had to cover certain costs that they hadn't had to cover from a medical perspective or whatever it might be. So recognizing that there might be some financial insecurity issues here, and being aware of that, and helping to navigate some of that for your employees. So what do we do? How do we actually take action? How do we take this unlearning that we're doing, and how do we actually now move to what's next? So, you're recognizing your bias, you're understanding that there are things that maybe you believe you shouldn't, or maybe there's things that you need to dig more in, or just think critically about. And so now it's what do we actually do? What action should we take? So a couple things, and I'd like to share these with folks. And I urge you, if you have your cell phone out, take a picture, because this is one that I think you can definitely use and take with you. And, this covers all of your bases of, which way you like to take in different information. But there's a great book by Claude Steele called Whistling Vivaldi. And this book really digs into some of the research that has been done around gender, around race and ethnicity, and how that impacts people, and how they actually react to some of the bias that is in play, both in, in testing and research, and just every day. It's just a really interesting book. And if you're a data nerd like me, you'll love it. The Witches Are Coming is another one that is just a great read, because it gives you some context around issues on gender equality, and kind of where we're seeing pushback, where we're seeing concerns. So it's another I would highly recommend. And then, So You Want to Talk About Race is another. I'm not going to try and pronounce the name of the author because I never get it correct. But this is, I think, is a great kind of starter point for folks that are just starting their journey around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and want to understand more about the conversation. If you're more of a movie watcher, or someone who likes to interact and do different things, I encourage you to watch the movie. There's also The Social Dilemma. So, that Socialization that I mentioned earlier. If you have not seen The Social Dilemma, I highly encourage you to watch it. If you have children, it will scare you. It's definitely something that, everyone should watch, because it talks about how we are inundated with messaging, and how we are kind of encouraged to believe certain ways. And then I Am Not Your Negro. So this is based on some of the readings and reflections of James Baldwin. And it is just it's a beautiful film. And it really just talks about some of the historical interactions that James Baldwin had, and, how he saw and was there to see some of these different moments in history. And it's amazing. And then for more, if you want to take more action, Rachel Cargill actually has a really cool thing that she does. It's called The Great Unlearn. And you get daily reminders of different actions to take, different things to watch and do. And it's just another way to be thinking about this race conversation, and be thinking about how do we continue to unlearn what has been inundated, what we have been socialized to believe over time. The wonderful Brene Brown, if you have not heard, she has a podcast, and she has had some amazing guests on. One of her first guests was actually Tarana Burke, so the woman who started the Me Too movement. And, she talks about the Me Too movement, but more importantly, she talks about empathy. And so all of Brene Brown's guests, there's a lot of conversations about empathy and processing everything that's going on in the world today. So I highly encourage you to subscribe to the Unlocking Us podcast. And then personal plug, of course, the Inclusive AF podcast. My friend Jackie Clayton and I talk a lot about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and different, things going on in the world today, and how that's impacting the workplace and how that's impacting each of us. And then the Living Corporate podcast is another one that has some absolutely amazing guests on it, and the perspective that they take is really neat. And so it's one of those things that if you are a podcast listener, there are 3 that I would mention for you. And the last piece here is to follow someone that doesn't look like you, talk like you, or have the same beliefs that you do. And I encourage this, and I know, we can talk about Facebook and, hey, we've probably, dropped folks from Facebook that maybe were a little too far into their beliefs. But really what I'm talking about here is more around LinkedIn and some of the other spaces that you can start to hear voices and start to hear different things from folks that don't look like you. And this is also a nice way to start to build your network in a different way. A lot of times, when we talk about networking, what we talk about is, we use our network. We have our network use us to connect us. And we want to be that connector for other folks as well. The more diverse your network is, the better off you are, because you're hearing different voices, you're hearing different perspectives. What can we do for our employees? So this is another one that I think, I'd like to call this out, because I think when we think about a lot of this stuff, and you're probably, glancing through this list thinking, yeah, I want all of those things myself, because I think a lot of these are ones that are impacting all of us. And so it's just really good to be aware of it, and be aware of, what is out there and what you can do as a leader, what you can do as a peer in an organization, all of those things. So the first one is, parenting and homeschooling resources. And I think a lot of organizations have shared some of these tools, but just again, even if it's not actual resources or, hey, here's some tips and tricks or anything like that, but just the acknowledgement of what parents are going through and understanding that this is a tough time, and, they're trying to navigate their children's mental well-being and all of these other things. So recognizing that and really being aware of it. The second one is mental health and bereavement counseling. So, I think a lot of companies, we've talked about mental health, but we also need to talk about, the impact of COVID and, how that has impacted our employee population. So, if there is bereavement counseling that you can get through your employee assistance program, or if you can contact someone to come in and just do some bereavement counseling for the team or for individuals that might have had a family member that's been impacted by COVID-19. But it's also about, what is the policy state? I've had a lot of questions recently about, our bereavement policy only covers parents and children. What should we do? Thinking about, who are the other folks that people might need time off to process, to go to, if there is a funeral service, things along those lines. So just being aware of that. I already mentioned this, but the performance review criteria. I think this is one that, every organization has been impacted in some way. And, whether that is, hey, our online sales are much different than, our in-person sales, or it could be, hey, what, the goals that we set for ourselves this year, we didn't even come close to meeting them, and, what that might look like from a review perspective. So being thoughtful about what your performance review criteria is, and making sure that you're really creating a space where folks know, I'm not going to get dinged at the end of the year, or I'm not going to get dinged, in the review for 2020 because the company just wasn't able to meet their goals. And then the last one is emergency loans and grants. And I know, for a lot of organizations, they're trying to figure out, how do they make people whole, and how do they, help folks that are in a financial situation that they haven't seen before. And this emergency loans and grants, I think, is another one that, if you are able to, it's just another way to show your employees that you do care about them, and that you are thinking about them, and recognizing the strain that people are under. So that is, my presentation. I wanted to, share some different tips and tools, but I also have some options that, if you want to actually have an audit on how you're doing from a diversity, equity, and inclusion space. If there are questions that you have that, on something that I covered, if any of the language wasn't familiar to you, feel free to reach out to me at kvh@vhincluded.com or on the website. Would love to hear your questions. And I know we're going to open it up now for Q&A. So Mary Lynn, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yes, thank you so much. That was awesome. We did have a question earlier on what is the one step we can do today to get started, but she said you answered her question and that
Okay.
it was awesome. So
Okay.
thank you for all those great ideas. Another question we had was to understand another's feelings when I have not had their experience or wanting to understand it more. Is asking them to teach me, or is it better to say, what can I do? Or is it better to think, what can I do to teach myself?
Yep. So a great question. So I think this is one that there are multiple answers to this question, because I think, what we know, and I think all of us can kind of take this into consideration, is the emotional gymnastics that folks who are in certain marginalized groups have to go through on a day-to-day basis to educate others, to walk through different concepts, those types of things. So I always say to start by looking things up yourself, or the expression I use is GTS, or Google that stuff. I might not say stuff when I tell you, but go out and Google it. So if you have a question, start by Googling it. Start by looking at where are there resources, where are there things that you can do. And I think we all know, we all probably received a link or a Google sheet or something when all of the issues were happening over the summer with racial injustice and with the murders of people of color. We know that there are resources out there, books, movies, things that we can do. I shared a few of them in this deck. And so I think start there, start to educate yourself and take that responsibility yourself. And then I think it's also, if you have that relationship that you can have those conversations with someone, do it, but also give them the space of, if this is not the time, or if you don't feel like having this conversation right now, that's okay. Giving folks permission to kind of opt out, because I think there is this, so Jackie, the person that I co-host the podcast with, she is a Black woman living in Waco, Texas, and she got inundated. Hey, tell me what it's like to be a Black woman, or what I should think about. You're a Black woman, so tell me all the things. And obviously that's not the approach. But if you have a relationship with someone and you feel comfortable asking the question, but also allowing them that out of, if this is not a good time, if you don't feel like having this conversation, then I think it's okay to ask folks that are around you or in those different communities.
Awesome. Thank you. Tara Hall said that she has a question. So Tara's going to ask you live. There you go, Tara.
All right.
Thank you. I think you kind of answered a little bit of it from the previous question, but thank you, Katie, for sharing your expertise and information. Truly enjoyed it. So I am a director here at Mesa Police Department. And if you saw in the chat, I brought a lot of people from our diversity and inclusion team. So really excited to have them have the opportunity to listen. One of the questions I wanted to ask was, as we grow in our team for the departments, how do we encourage those? I mean, obviously the ones that are here want to be here and listen, right? And be part of the conversations. So how do we encourage others on the team to bring people, to be part of the team as well? Because sometimes diversity and inclusion, those terms can seem intimidating, or so any ideas that you would have for us and those efforts?
Absolutely. So I think, this is the conundrum of DEI consultants, is that the folks that are in the room are usually the ones that already know the answers to the questions, and it's other folks we need to encourage to come and join the conversation. So I think a lot of times what I've seen organizations do is either approach it from hey, everyone needs to attend this. So, making trainings or conversations mandatory. I am not such a fan of that, because I then think there's almost a resentment there, or a defensiveness there. What I encourage folks to do is approach it from different places. So it could be, hey, we're all going to watch 13th and then have a conversation about it. And, I think approaching it from the perspective of also, obviously being in a police department, I think there are certain challenges that you might have right now, because there are certain feelings in law enforcement and otherwise. And so I actually have a client in Florida that they build the systems for police departments. And we really approached it from the perspective of, this is just an awareness building. This isn't a mandatory training or an HR training. It's just trying to help people with language, trying to help people with understanding what are some of the issues that folks are facing. I think if you approach it from a not a accusatory or putting people on the defense, I think that's such a better approach, because if people feel like they're being scolded or being told that they're doing something wrong and you're trying to fix them, especially adult learners, it doesn't go well. It doesn't land. And I think we all know that. And I'm seeing some shaking heads of yes, because it's definitely something that comes up. But I approach it just from, having more informal conversations, Tara. So if there's a book you want to read, or if there's a excerpt from a book, hey, let's all read this and then have a conversation about it over our next team meeting for the first 15 minutes, something along those lines, just to open the conversation. And then there's also some resources, and if you email me, I can send you some resources that have, here's some definitions of words. Because I think the language piece is a challenge for folks a lot of times, and they go, I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't want to do the wrong thing. And then that goes to the last piece, is letting people know this is safe. And you're going to ask questions that you might go, wow, I don't know the right language to use for this question. And the way that I approach that is, hey, being aware of the words that you're choosing. So we start with, hey, assuming positive intent, but then it's also understanding the impact of our words. So we have to create that balance within these conversations to know that when we are using the wrong words, it can impact people in the conversation, but we're also trying to assume positive intent of, if the person's asking a question, they truly want to know. They're not doing it from a place of anything funky. It really is just, I'm trying to learn. So
Thank you for sharing.
Awesome. Thank you, Tara. We do have another question, and it is, can you talk about intersectionality?
Absolutely. So intersectionality is kind of the, we are not just one thing. So that's probably the most basic way to put it. But really, when you think about yourself as an individual and how you identify, none of us, it's not, hey, I am a woman, full stop, the end. Other pieces to our identity and other pieces to how we think about this. And what I encourage folks to do, there's a great resource, if you want to Google it. It's basically just, the identity wheel or the diversity wheel. And it gives you different things to be thinking about. So this is things like birth order. Are you married? Do you have kids? What is your sexual orientation? What is your gender identity? All of these different pieces, because all of those pieces make us into a human. And that's kind of where that intersectionality is what are all of those things? What are all the different pieces that make us who we are? And it's not just one thing. And it might be we focus on one certain identity in certain conversations or in certain environments, but all of us are made up of many different parts.
Awesome. Thank you. Are there any tech AI platforms that you feel are being used effectively for DEI?
Yes, there are a few that I think are emerging, and I think the question around AI, and I think some of us know this and are trying to work through this. When we think about AI and some of the kind of machine learning pieces, it's hard because it's still a human building it. And so, there is bias because the human is building it. But when we think about some of the platforms that are working, there's a tool called Canarys, Kanarys. And that's one where people can go in and put a review about their organization in regards to diversity. And I think that's a really great tool to kind of get folks started of, putting your profile in there and starting to understand what is the sentiment of your employees around some of these topics. There's also, from a recruiting perspective, Jackie, my co-host, actually works for Seek Out. So SEEKOUT.io. And they are doing some stuff around how do you source candidates? How do you think about pulling folks into the conversation? And then there's a lot of different resources for just job seekers, for folks that are trying to learn more. And I think all of the platforms, if you Google Rachel Cargill, all of the things she is doing in her organization and her nonprofit are huge to help advance these conversations. But from a platform and a tech perspective, there's a few, but there is definitely a lot of work that needs to be done and a lot of things. I am on an advisory board for Hitchworks, which is a gig economy type platform. And it's, how do you actually help people to move into new roles and get new skill sets, all of these things. And that's another one that I think is really emerging. And especially in the US, we need to start thinking about the gig economy a little bit more and how we can help skill people in a different way than that traditional career ladder, career path.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, that looks like all the questions. Those were all awesome questions. So thank you so much for another great webinar. I certainly learned a lot and wrote down a few notes that I'm going to take away today. So now don't go away because we're going to do some announcements. So hang on here. Right now we have sponsorships available. We're doing a 2-for-1 special. You can sponsor our spring event, which is happening on February 16th, Lead the Life You Love. That is a hop-in virtual event. And then we have our Hail Awards in March, on March 25th. That will be live at Clayton House, but we will have a virtual component if you're not comfortable attending live. We are also looking for raffle items. So today's raffle item was donated by Collaborative Event Management. And thank you, Collaborative Event Management. And you can also donate a raffle prize for our events. But our big thing that we're promoting right now is our Young Athenas program. I think you saw the slide in the slideshow before we got started. And we were talking about mental health and understanding the current challenges. And I just want to reach out to your heartstrings and remind you that high school students are going through mental health issues right now with their current challenge of having to do school online and not in person and missing out on their friends. Today I read a really great quote, and it says, "When a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows, not the flower." And that was by Alexander Den Heiger. I don't know if I pronounced his name right, but that was his quote. And that's what we want to do. We want to help the young Athenas with their environment and help them learn how to be leaders of the future and give them that personal contact and help them, give them mentees. So it's real important that we sponsor our Young Athenas program. And you can do that by just going online to the Athena website, which is ATHENAAZ.com, and click on sponsorships, and you'll see how you can sponsor a Young Athena. I always neglect to introduce myself. I assume everybody knows me, and that's kind of bias in itself, self-bias, I guess. But my name is Mary Lynn Chrisman. I'm a Collaborative Event Management and the committee chair for the events committee. So I put these events together for Athena Valley of the Sun. And again, I just want to remind you, our next one is February 16th. It'll be on Hopin. We have Karen Russo, who's with us today. I saw her in the list here. She'll be speaking as well as Carrie Conley. And then we have little breakout rooms for that are being presented by our HAIL 2021 recipients. So that's really exciting. And we have a couple of great sponsors who's on here today too. Home with Care and the Mesa Police Department are two sponsors so far for the spring conference. So thank you for being sponsors. But, you know, being part of bias is being inclusive, and there's still opportunity to you to be included in that sponsorship list. So if you're interested in sponsoring, you can go to ATHENAAZ.com and click on sponsorships and sign up. So we have a raffle prize of $25 Amazon gift card. So I have loaded all of your names into a random name picker. And if you're interested in learning how to do that, it's commentpicker.com. And I'm going to push start. on my random picker, it's going to pick a name and that will be our winner. If you're not here, I will do it again. Is Erica Vance here? Erica, do you want to unmute? Are you here, Erica Vance?
Yes, ma'am. I am
Yay,
here.
you're the winner. Awesome. Congratulations. I have your email address and I will email you that gift card. So thank you for participating today. And we have 1 minute. Does anybody want to say anything before we go? And you're also welcome if you're interested in doing networking. I'll do some networking after if you want to stay past.
Thank you all for having me. I appreciate it, Dr. Quaid. I appreciate you having me join. And Mary Lynn, thank you for all your help.
Can I say something quickly, Mary Lynn?
Absolutely.
Well, I just wanted to thank Sherry Jones for being here. And I wanted to say that when Dr. Christine Quaid was introduced, she's the outgoing board chair of Athena International. People need to know what a powerhouse we're dealing with here in Phoenix, the Valley of the Sun. Yes.
Awesome. Yes. Thank you, Sherry
funny.
Jones, the new
For the
international.
incoming.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank
board
you so
member.
much. It's been phenomenal. I love spending the last hour with you. So insightful and wonderful to see all of you. Thank you. And love you all, Christine, especially.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And Karen, there's Karen. Wave to us, Karen. We'll see you next month. We're so excited for your presentation. Alrighty. Thank you all.